The doors opened slowly, and cold air swept into the courtroom as the woman stepped inside wearing a long gray coat that brushed her ankles with every step and a scarf wrapped tight around her neck, hiding the lower half of her face. And she carried no bag, no papers, no phone, nothing in her hands but silence. People turned to look at her, eyes wide and confused, because she didn't belong to any side, not with the defense, not with the prosecution, not even among the audience. And yet she moved forward without fear, without pause, like she had walked this road many times before. She walked down the aisle between rows of strangers who whispered to each other, asking, "Who is she? What is she doing here? Is she part of the case?" No one had seen her before, not once during the trial, and yet there she was, moving toward the front with calm steps and straight shoulders. The bailiff looked nervous and took one step forward to stop her, but before he could speak, the judge stood up slowly, rising from his seat on the high bench, and his eyes locked onto hers like he had seen a ghost from long ago. The room fell into silence, not the kind that comes from waiting, but the heavy kind that presses on your chest and makes you forget to breathe because something was happening, something that no one expected. The judge raised his hand to his temple and gave her a full salute, a military salute, sharp and respectful, and held it there for a long second before lowering it and saying in a voice that carried across the courtroom, "This court recognizes her authority." No one moved, not even the general sitting behind the defense table, who had spoken with pride all morning, who had smiled as he denied each accusation, but now he sat frozen, as if the past had walked into the room to face him. The woman in gray said nothing. She gave the judge a small nod and turned slowly to sit in the front row just behind the prosecution, and still she did not speak, did not remove her scarf, did not shift in her seat. The lawyers looked at each other, the audience stared, someone took a shaky breath, but no one dared to ask who she was, not yet, not with the judge standing and looking shaken, like he had just seen the face of someone who was never meant to return. Outside the building, reporters stood in the rain, unaware of what had just happened inside, unaware that a silent storm had entered the courtroom dressed in gray. The prosecutor cleared his throat and tried to continue with the case, his voice faltering at first, but growing steadier as he pointed toward the general and laid out the next part of the evidence. But the focus was no longer on the trial, not really, because everyone kept glancing toward the silent woman, and the judge, who kept stealing looks her way. A young intern sitting near the back whispered to his colleague, "I think I've seen her before in a photo somewhere, maybe in an old article, maybe from the war. Maybe she's not just anyone, maybe she's someone we should all remember." But the woman remained still, unmoving, as if carved from stone, or perhaps made from fire that had turned cold long ago. The general looked over his shoulder once, twice, then again, and his fingers tapped nervously on the desk, his eyes wide with something close to fear, something deep, something buried. The judge tried to refocus his attention, but his hands trembled slightly, and he pressed them to the bench, as if needing to remind himself where he was, needing to hold on to the present before it was pulled back into the past. A child sitting near the front tugged at her mother's sleeve and asked softly, "Is she a soldier?" The mother did not answer, only stared. The silence returned again, thick and full of weight, as the general stood up suddenly, without being called, and said in a loud voice, "I demand to know who she is, what gives her the right to be here." But the woman did not answer. She did not even blink. The judge slammed his gavel once and said firmly, "She has every right, more than you ever did." That one sentence broke the room like glass. Gasps filled the air, and people turned to one another, trying to understand what they had just heard, trying to make sense of a puzzle that had no edges. The general sat down again slowly, his face pale, sweat forming on his forehead, and his hands shaking slightly. And still she sat there, quiet and watching, not angry, not afraid, just present, like a shadow returned to light. The rest of the day passed in a blur, with voices rising and falling, with evidence shared and arguments made, but through it all the woman in gray remained silent. When the session ended and people began to leave, many turned to look at her one last time, but she stayed seated, eyes on the front of the courtroom, like she was waiting for something, like she was not done yet. And as the judge stood once more to leave, he gave her one more silent salute before walking away. No one dared to stop her, no one dared to speak to her. She rose and walked out just as she had entered, without a word, wrapped in gray, wrapped in mystery, wrapped in power that needed no name. You said, please write part 2 of the story, make it more unique and engaging. Using simple and basic English, the part should be exactly 800 words, and written in third-person style. Do not use any full stops, dots. Anywhere in the text, ensure the story continues smoothly and keeps the audience hooked from the start. The news spread fast before the courtroom doors had even closed. People were already asking questions, sharing clips, whispering her name, though no one knew it. Yet they called her the woman in gray, and said the judge had saluted her like a soldier, not like a guest or a witness, but like someone who once gave orders and had them followed without question. Outside the courthouse, the rain kept falling, but the reporter by the steps looked straight into the camera and said something strange just happened inside, something no one expected. The judge rose from his seat and gave a military salute to a woman no one could identify. And now the whole city wants to know who she is. Inside the courtroom, the general sat with his hands folded tightly together, his mouth dry, his throat tight. He glanced again toward the front row where the woman in gray had been, but her seat was empty. Now she had vanished just as quietly as she arrived, and no one saw her go. The defense lawyer leaned in and asked if he was all right. The general didn't answer. Right away his fingers twitched, his jaw clenched. Finally, he whispered something that made the lawyer lean back in surprise. He said, "She's supposed to be dead." The courtroom buzzed with quiet tension as the judge returned to his chambers, his face pale, his hands still shaking. The bailiff brought him a glass of water and asked if he needed to rest. The judge shook his head slowly and said, "No, I need to find her again." Across town, a young reporter named Kieran sat in a small office filled with dusty records, old files, and stacks of photos. She had seen the news alert pop up on her phone, and something about the woman's face, or maybe her presence, triggered a memory. She started digging through old articles from the war zone from years ago, from battles most people had forgotten. Kieran found a photo, black and white, blurry, taken during a night operation. It showed a soldier in a long coat, standing among burning buildings, carrying a child over one shoulder, and behind her was a line of rescued villagers, all staring at her, like she was more than a soldier, like she was hope. The caption read, "Identity unknown," but later scribbled in red ink were the words, "Classified by order of command." Kieran leaned closer and whispered to herself, "It's her, it has to be." She ran to her editor, who waved her off at first until she showed the photo. Then everything changed. Back in the courtroom, the trial continued, but the energy was different. Everyone looked over their shoulder, expecting her to return, expecting something to break the silence again. The general sat still now, no longer smiling, no longer proud. The prosecutor noticed and pushed harder, showing maps and reports detailing the villages lost, the orders given, the attacks denied, but linked to his name and his voice, and still the general said nothing. In another part of the city, an old soldier named Malik sat in his garden watching the rain fall. He had fought in the same war, and when he saw her photo on the news, he dropped his cup, his hands shaking, as he said her name softly, but no one heard it, because no one was left who knew her like he did. She was the one who stopped the massacre. He whispered, the one who walked into fire when everyone else ran. She wasn't supposed to be here anymore, not in this world, not after what they did to her. Later that day, Kieran visited Malik with her photo and asked if he recognized the woman. He nodded slowly, and tears filled his eyes. He told her stories about the mission, about the village, about the night they thought she died, and how he saw her fall, but never saw her body. He said they erased her name from the records, made her vanish, because she stood up against them, because she refused to obey orders that hurt the innocent, and now she's back in the courtroom of the very man who gave those orders. Kieran asked what her name was, but Malik said names of power, and some names are not spoken until the time is right. Meanwhile, the judge sat alone in his chambers, holding an old medal in his hand, a medal given to a hero whose file had been buried, whose actions had been denied by those in command, and whose silence had been bought with threats and lies. He looked out the window and whispered, "You should have never had to come back." That night the city buzzed with questions. People online shared theories about the woman in gray, calling her Ghost Commander, Silent Justice, and Firewalker. No one agreed on the name, but everyone agreed on one thing: she had changed the trial without saying a word. In the dark of the courthouse, cameras caught her silhouette just before midnight, standing by the memorial wall, reading each name carved into stone, her hand resting for a moment on a single line before she turned and vanished once more. The court was set to resume the next morning, but nothing felt normal, not anymore. because now they knew someone was watching someone who had seen the worst and survived, someone who was not supposed to return, but did anyway, not for fame, not for revenge, but maybe just to remind them that truth never stays buried forever. And in that silence, everyone waited for her to speak again. The courtroom doors opened again, and the woman in gray stepped inside just as the judge was about to begin the next session, and every head in the room turned toward her as if drawn by an invisible force, eyes, wide breaths, held not because of fear, but because of something deeper, something strange and heavy. She walked with the same calm steps, wearing the same long gray coat or scarf, still hiding the bottom half of her face, her eyes steady and cold. And she sat in the same front row seat, never looking to the left or right, only straight ahead, as if the walls could speak, and she was listening to their voice. The general sat behind his defense table, his eyes fixed on her with growing panic, his fingers clenching the armrest, so hard his knuckles turned white, and his lawyer leaned in and whispered, but the general waved him away, eyes locked only on her face like he was watching a ghost crawl out of his own sins. The judge looked at her once, then turned to the courtroom and said, "We will proceed with the testimony from the survivor of base 17. But even before he finished, the general stood up, his voice shaky, but loud enough to say, "Your Honor, I request a private recess before we begin." The judge narrowed his eyes and asked why the general looked toward the woman and said, "I need to speak with her, just her, no one else. I must understand what she wants from me." The woman did not move. She gave no answer, and the judge asked her quietly if she agreed to the meeting. After a long pause, she stood and gave a slow nod, then followed the general and the guards into a quiet back room watched by security cameras and 2 silent officers. Inside the room, the general turned to her once the door closed, his face twisted with fear and memory, and he said, "I saw your body. They told me you were dead. They showed me the footage, and still you're here. What do you want?" The woman remained still and silent until the general dropped to the chair and rubbed his hands over his face, saying, "You were supposed to burn in that building. You were the only one who knew what I ordered, and I made sure you would not speak again." The woman stepped closer, her coat swaying with each move, her eyes never blinking, and then she slowly pulled a folded paper from her pocket, placing it on the table between them. And when the general opened it, he froze. It was a photo, black and white, taken from a drone camera, showing him giving the order, showing him pointing toward the village, showing the timestamp, showing everything he denied for years. The general leaned back like the chair had become fire, and he whispered, "You kept it all this time. Why didn't you come forward before?" She replied in a soft voice filled with years of pain, "Because I believed someone else would do the right thing, and I was wrong." He shook his head again, and again, his hands shaking, now his mouth dry, his voice gone. And then he looked up at her and asked, "Are you here to end me, to destroy everything I built?" She answered, "No, I'm here to watch the truth catch up with you. I don't need to destroy anything. I just needed to be here when it finally happened." Back in the courtroom, whispers spread like smoke. People wondered what was said in that room, what words made the general so pale when he returned, his legs barely carrying him forward, his eyes empty as he sat down without a word. The judge resumed the hearing, calling the next witness and reading new evidence aloud, but most eyes stayed on the woman in gray, who returned to her seat with the same quiet grace and sat with hands folded, eyes forward, heart unreadable. As the day went on, the general stopped responding to his lawyer, stopped defending himself, stopped pretending he was innocent, because now the past was in the room, and it wore a gray coat and silent boots. During a short break, a young court officer walked up to the judge with a file marked classified. The officer said, "Someone left this for you outside. No name, no message, just the seal of the old military division, long believed to be dissolved." Inside the file were reports, dates, photos, messages, all matching what the woman had seen, all proving what the general had done and what others had hidden for years. And the judge stared at the file, then looked at the woman, then back at the paper, and knew the trial had changed again. That night the news called it a turning point. They showed clips of the general looking broken, of the courtroom frozen in silence, of the woman in gray walking alone down the steps, as the wind blew around her, like even nature stepped aside to let her pass. And in the darkness of a quiet alley, she stood for a moment under a flickering streetlight, closed her eyes, and whispered to no one. "I kept walking because the voices of the dead would not let me stop." Then she vanished into the night, again leaving behind silence, and a courtroom forever changed. The sun rose slow behind heavy clouds, and the city still whispered about the courtroom. The woman in gray, and the general, who no longer spoke the news, showed her photo, but never her name. Only the moment the judge stood and saluted her, and people across the country asked the same question: who is she, and why does she carry so much silence? In a dusty archive 2 stories below the courthouse, a clerk opened an old drawer marked with red tape. The drawer had not been touched in years, and the files inside smelled like dust and memory. One folder stood out thicker than the rest, stamped with the word classified and sealed with the symbol of a forgotten unit. The clerk blinked, confused. He had never seen that symbol before, but something about it made him uneasy, so he brought it to the judge's office and left it without a word. When the judge opened it, his hands trembled. The first page showed a photograph taken long ago, a battlefield in flames, a lone figure walking through smoke with children behind her eyes, forward jaw clenched, body burned, but still standing. No name was listed, only a call sign: Ghost Wind. The report said she refused medals, turned down rank, and disappeared after the final operation, presumed dead, no body recovered. More pages told stories of missions erased from public record, of lives saved behind enemy lines, of one woman who kept fighting even when everyone else gave up, and who vanished after refusing to carry out an order to destroy a civilian village. The judge closed the file slowly and stared out the window, thinking about the woman in gray, thinking about her silence, and how it said more than any witness ever could. In the courtroom, the trial resumed. The general sat quiet, his hands folded, his eyes on the floor, as if waiting for something to happen, as if he already knew what was coming and had stopped trying to run from it. The woman in gray entered without a sound and sat in the same seat, wearing the same coat and scarf, her face unreadable, her presence sharp and cold like a blade that never rusts. The prosecutor stepped forward and introduced a new witness, a young woman with dark eyes and a quiet voice. She took the stand and said she had lived in the village that was destroyed. She had seen the helicopters. She had heard the orders. She had watched people die. She also said a soldier in gray pulled her from the rubble, carried her to safety, and disappeared before anyone could thank her. The general looked up once, then dropped his gaze again. The judge held up the file just received and asked the court if the name Ghost Wind meant anything. The prosecutor said yes, that name was spoken in whispers during the war, usually with respect, sometimes with fear, and always with wonder. The general looked up again, and this time he spoke, his voice cracked and low and full of regret. He said, she defied me. I gave the order, and she refused. I tried to erase her, but she survived. The courtroom fell silent as the woman in gray stood and took one step forward, eyes locked on him. The judge asked, do you wish to testify? And she nodded, then walked to the witness, stand her hands, steady her coat, still dripping from the rain outside. She spoke in simple words, telling what she saw, what she felt, what she refused to do. She told of the mission, the village, the order that came from above to level everything and leave nothing behind. She told of how she looked into the eyes of the children and knew she could not follow that order. She told of the night she fled the base, carrying survivors through the forest, hunted by her own team, betrayed by the man now sitting in front of her. Her words never rose in anger. They were soft and calm, but they carried weight heavy enough to break the strongest defense. The general began to weep, not loudly, not with drama, but with quiet shame, the kind that grows over time and crushes what is left of a person. The judge asked her why she came back now after so many years, and she said because silence can only protect the guilty for so long, and the dead deserve more than silence. When her testimony ended, she returned to her seat and said nothing else. The court took a break, and outside the building people gathered holding photos, candles, and signs that read, "We remember," and "Justice for the lost." The city knew now who she was, not by name, not by title, but by truth, and that was enough for them. As the night came, the judge stayed late reading the rest of the file, reading about a hero who never asked to be called one, a soldier who chose mercy over medals and vanished into the smoke. He closed the file one last time and placed it on the bench beside him, then looked toward the door, wondering if she would return again for the final judgment or if her duty was now complete. And somewhere in the shadows, she waited quiet and unseen, ready for the end she had always known would come. The courtroom was packed with more people than ever. Before, some came to see justice, some came to see her, some came because they had once heard the name Ghost Wind and never believed she was real. But now she sat in the front row, wearing her gray coat, her scarf still hiding her face, and her eyes fixed on the man who once tried to erase her from the world. The judge entered holding the same classified file he had read all night, his hands steady, his voice calm, but there was something different in the air, now something heavier, like the walls themselves were waiting to breathe. The general looked older, now tired, broken. He had not spoken since the day before, and his lawyer no longer tried to defend him, no longer looked proud, no longer looked sure of anything. The prosecutor stood and said, "We call the final witness," and pointed to the woman in gray. The courtroom fell silent as she rose from her seat and walked slowly to the stand, her footsteps soft, but every ear heard them, every heart beat louder as she passed. She sat down and removed her scarf for the first time. The room gasped. Her face was marked by scars, but her eyes were clear, steady, and unshaken. Her voice, when she spoke, was low but strong, and every word carried weight. She said, "I was a soldier. Once I followed orders. I did what I had to do. But one day the order came to burn a village, to erase lives that had done nothing wrong. And that day I made a choice. I chose to save instead of destroy." She told of the children. She carried the wounded. She protected the betrayal that followed. And the night she disappeared into the forest, alone, hunted by her own side, because she chose mercy over orders. The judge asked her why she never spoke before, why she stayed silent all these years, and she said because speaking meant remembering, and remembering meant pain. She looked at the general and said, "You gave the order, you knew what would happen, and when I refused, you made sure no one would ever know what I did." The general said nothing, his face pale, his hands shaking. He tried to speak, but no words came, only breath heavy and sharp like he was drowning in memories. She continued, "I watched villages burn. I watched good men turn into monsters. I watched honor die in silence. And I carried it with me every day, because someone had to." The courtroom listened without a sound. No one blinked. No one moved. Every word she said stayed in the air, like smoke that would never fade. The prosecutor asked her one last question, "What do you want from this trial?" And she answered, "I don't want revenge. I don't want medals. I want truth to stand in the open and not be buried in files and fear." The judge closed the file beside him and said, "Your words are heard," and remembered. He looked at the general and said, "Do you have anything to say before we continue?" The general stood slowly, barely able to keep balance, and said, "I thought killing her would end the guilt. I thought silence would save me. But her silence was louder than anything I ever said." He looked at her and said, "I was wrong, I was weak, and I am sorry." The judge nodded and called for a break. The crowd stood. The woman stepped down from the witness stand and returned to her seat, and still she said nothing more. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. They held candles, photos of lost family members' stories, once denied by the government and now made real by her testimony. An old man held a sign that said, "She saved my brother," and a child held a flower and asked his mother, "Is she a hero?" The mother said yes, but she never asked to be one. That night the news played clips of her testimony. Across every channel people watched in silence. Some cried, some sat in awe, but all of them felt the same thing, something real, something true, something that could not be hidden anymore. The judge stayed late in his office, once again holding the photo of her from the old file, the one with the flames behind her and the child in her arms, and he whispered to himself, "We failed you then, but not now, not again." The woman in gray stood on the courthouse steps. As the night grew cold, she looked at the sky for a long time, then turned and walked into the darkness, without a word once more. And though she left behind no name, no speech, no reward, the weight of her silence stayed with them all, reminding them that sometimes the loudest justice comes from the quietest truth. The courtroom buzzed with quiet energy as people filled every seat. The walls seemed tighter, the air more still, like the whole building was holding its breath, waiting for the final moment to arrive. Reporters whispered into their mics. Officers stood stiff by the doors, and citizens young and old leaned forward, watching the front of the room, where the woman in gray sat silent and still, just as she had before. She wore the same long coat, the same calm expression, And though the world now knew pieces of her story, her name still remained unknown to most. But that no longer mattered, because what she had done spoke louder than any title or rank ever could. The judge entered carrying the final ruling in his hand, his face serious, but not cold, and as he sat down, he looked first at the general, who sat motionless, then at the woman in gray, who met his gaze without flinching. Then he looked out at the court and said, "Today we close a chapter that was never meant to be hidden in the first place." The judge read the verdict slowly, each word clear, and final: the general was found guilty on all charges: crimes against civilians, abuse of power, attempted silencing of witnesses, and betrayal of military code. The sentence was long and just, but even as the judge finished, the courtroom remained silent, not in shock, not in protest, but in quiet recognition that justice had finally stood tall where once it had fallen. The general did not speak, did not rise, did not cry. He simply lowered his head and closed his eyes as if accepting what had waited for him all along. Then the judge turned to the woman in gray and stood slowly again, just like he did on the first day, and once more he raised his hand in a sharp salute, held it firm for a long moment, and said in a voice full of respect, "This court recognizes your courage, your sacrifice, and your truth." One by one the others in the courtroom began to rise, first the bailiff, then the guards, then the people in the front row, and then all the way to the back, and they stood without being asked, as if guided by something deeper than law or duty, and slowly some placed their hands to their foreheads, others placed them over their hearts, and some simply bowed their heads. The woman in gray stood too, but not to return the salute. Instead, she gave a small, respectful nod and turned to leave, her coat flowing behind her, her steps light but sure, and no one dared to stop her, no one dared to speak. Outside the courthouse, the crowd stood quiet, holding candle signs and photos, and as she stepped into view, someone began to clap slowly, gently, not for fame, not for applause, but for gratitude, and it spread until the entire crowd was clapping softly as she passed. A young girl broke through the line and ran up to her, holding a folded piece of paper. She said, "You saved my mother during the war. She told me your story, and she said, if I ever saw you, I should say thank you." The woman knelt slowly, took the paper with both hands, and whispered, "Thank you, child," then rose again and continued walking. As she reached the edge of the crowd, a reporter called out, "Will you give us your name?" And she paused for a moment, looked over her shoulder, and said softly, "My name was never the point." Then she walked away down the steps into the street, into the cold wind that tugged at her coat and scattered the voices of the past behind her. That night the city was quiet, no parties, no shouting, only soft light from windows and warm fires, as families sat together talking about courage, talking about truth, talking about the woman in gray. The news ran her image across every screen, the footage of the salute, the silent walk, the final words, and they called her a ghost, a warrior, a legend. But most of all, they called her real. At the courthouse, the judge remained in his chambers, holding the old classified file one last time, then placing it in a new box marked "Not Forgotten," and locking it in the Hall of Records where future generations could read it and learn. And somewhere far from the city, under a sky filled with stars, the woman in gray sat alone near a fire, staring into the flames, her hands warm, her eyes quiet, her mind finally still. She had not come for revenge or reward. She had come to speak the truth for those who could not, and now her voice had been heard. The fire crackled, the wind blew, the stars watched in silence, and for the first time in many years, she allowed herself to close her eyes and rest, because the war inside her had finally found peace.